Anarchy has always gotten a bad rap because, let's face it, no one in power likes the idea of anarchy. Because when that happens, that means the people in power don't get to be in power anymore. But anarchy has been with us for a really long time in human civilization. In fact, humanity has existed for most of its existence used twice, that's a good idea. Humanity has existed as a people in anarchy for most of its time. It wasn't really until hierarchical societies came about, mostly because of civilization, because we all got down and started to build cities, so we were all close together and started to need rules. That was really the only time we started to see hierarchical structures, both politically and religiously, primarily religiously to begin. And that's when anarchism as a philosophy started to have its seeds planted in the minds of people as a reaction against other people trying to seize power for themselves, understanding that, you know, if we're all close together, we do kind of need some rules. The first one to really write out an idea or a theory of anarchism was actually Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. And he wrote a writing it was entitled Zeno's Republic. There's not a whole lot of it left, I don't think, but it was a reaction to Plato, because we all know Plato's Republic, and that when we go read Plato's Republic, we start to see a lot of Plato's more totalitarian, even, ideas about how the state should essentially control every aspect of society because of a rigid class structure that's innate in our humanity. Zeno wrote his Republic to basically say, nah, Plato's a dick, we don't have to listen to him. Plato and Aristotle are really the two biggest enemies of anarchism, despite what you may think. Because Western philosophy is so heavily influenced by Plato and Aristotle, and those two people are both very heavily against anarchy, it's no surprise that most of Western philosophy and political thought is going to be about how to form the best government rather than simply asking how to form the best society. It just assumed from the start that the state is necessary. Plato himself argued about, he hated anarchy and even hated democracy, thinking it was a form of anarchy, simply because it violated the natural hierarchy of social classes, and Aristotle didn't like it because it was he that initially coined the idea that the state is the expression of society, and therefore the state is society. Anarchy as a political philosophy didn't start really coming about until the Age of Enlightenment, though. We all know Age of Enlightenment from our intro to poli-sci classes, or just encounter it every once in a while. Anyone who knows a little bit about the founding of our country knows that the founding fathers were influenced by essentially Enlightenment thinkers. The first one, though, was far before that, when France still had a substantial claim in the Americans, with Louis Armand, when he wrote New Voyages in Northern America. He first used the word anarchy. He was the first one to actually use the word anarchy in a positive light when he was describing the indigenous tribes of America, the various Indian tribes who basically had no system of political government, but some did have systems of private property, some were more collective. Regardless, he was the first one to actually use anarchy as a political system rather than simply a chaotic element of nastiness and hell. Hosea Warren, in America, he was the one that actually coined the term sovereignty of the individual, which those of you who have read Mill will understand, or Mill or Herbert Spencer. He was the one that actually coined that term. And Hosea Warren, in America, started to fuse a bit of mutualism, which we'll talk about later, and laid the groundwork for a more individualist anarchist society here in America. That was also built upon some more historical examples. For instance, in our own Pennsylvania, when William Penn had to go back to Britain for a while, he left, and the Quakers were like, we don't need this government. And so they just ignored it. In fact, the keeper of the seal, which they passed a law that the keeper of the seal had to stamp any law in order for it to be official, and the keeper of the seal refused to stamp any laws. And Pennsylvania essentially became the most prosperous colony of the British colonies here in America under an anarchist system. American philosophical anarchism pretty much stopped and cut its ties with any collectivist thought and went straight down the individualist path, especially in the late 1800s and 1900s. During the anti-slavery movement, the abolitionist movement, a guy named Lysander Spooner wrote No Treason, which was a massive thing about how the Constitution is essentially a load of crap. Benjamin Tucker, then, another big name, and I'm just sort of going through a quick history. Benjamin Tucker was the one who started to fuse mutualism with the individualist anarchism in order to create a rather awesome brand of American individual anarchism. In 1848-ish, before that, it was actually William Godwin who started to actually put philosophy down and say, yep, anarchism is not only just this cool idea of a society without a state, it's a legitimate political philosophy. So William Godwin was the one who accepted that government is only a necessary evil, but eventually it won't even be necessary, so it'll eventually just be evil, and we can get rid of it. It was in 1840 that a guy, I'm going to screw this up because it's French, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and I messed that up, but he wrote something called What is Property? And he was the one who, I'm sure you've heard the phrase, property is theft. He was the one who coined that. And he also came out with the phrase, liberty is the mother, not the daughter of order. He was the first one to write about spontaneous order, which, for those of you who know Austrian economics, you know Friedrich Hayek, that was his big phrase. Proudhon was actually the first one to use it, and he was basically describing how it was, in fact, people just being allowed to act as they wanted, and that will create a reasonable society. It was then Max Stirner who coined individual anarchism and egoist anarchism, basically saying rights are ghosts of the mind. And that's referring to a thing you might have learned in an intro to poli-sci class, the reification fallacy, which is basically taking an abstract idea and pretending that it's concrete. When you heard in the original video talking about we and talking about states or societies acting, that's essentially an example of the reification fallacy. You didn't really see a lot of collectivist anarchism until about 1864 in the First International. That's when the socialists started to really start kicking in on Europe. So it was the First International. That's when the mutualists got together, the socialists, and a lot of other left thinkers and big workers' movement, because that was the Industrial Revolution, people working in awful conditions in factories for, pennies, and obviously that sucks. But it was only 4 years later that you started to see a real divide in the thought, because you saw the Marxists fighting all of the mutualists. Because the Marxists, they were all like, yeah, we should get a massive state to control everything, and that'll be the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then eventually the state will go away. While the mutualists were all, we don't need politics at all, we don't need to overthrow anything, just ignore it. Just ignore the state, it'll go away on its own once we stop recognizing it as a legitimate entity. From there, anarcho-communism developed from the works of Mikhail Bakunin and Peter Kropotkin, Russian. And it was really the Russians that started to really develop communism as a theory, specifically an anarcho-communist. It wasn't later, it was actually Bakunin that wrote that the Marxists were dangerous and misguided because once they got in power, they were essentially going to take power and become the ruling class. And oh hey, Russian Revolution, what happened? Lenin did exactly that. And the last bit of just a quick anarchist history would be contemporary anarchism. Contemporary anarchism mostly came around from a resurgence in individual anarchism. Individual anarchism kind of died away because the anarchist label was strictly associated with the communists. With the Red Scare here in America, you're not gonna, you become an anarchist, you become a socialist, you become any of the state, you get thrown in prison for thinking. It came about mostly because of the civil rights movement and the counterculture, opposition to the war in Vietnam. It was really the expression of state power. The civil rights movement kicking in, equal rights, that whole liberal, classic liberal thought of everyone having equal rights rather than simply an equal share of the wealth of society really kicked in again, and that brought about a resurgence in anarchism, seeing that the state was kind of responsible for a lot of the bad things in society.
Nowadays, you see most of the activist groups tend to be collectivist anarchists. You see them in the black bloc. The G20 protest, if any of you are paying attention to that, especially in Toronto, where they set the whole frickin' city on fire after a while. But in the United States, it took a primarily individualist route and free market route. You see that a lot with Benjamin Tucker in his writings, Kevin Carson and the Mutualists, and also the anarcho-capitalists of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, of which Ron Paul was from. Though he's not an anarchist, I don't think. So that was not, I was trying to shove essentially 5,000 years of human history and political thought into 10 minutes. Obviously what I said is not nearly a comprehensive history of anarchism, nor did I touch on everything that anarchism could be or everything that influenced anarchism. I just can't. I didn't really touch on any of the interesting political movements. Spain during World War II and previous before World War II, the Spanish Civil War, you really see a lot of the different anarchist groups start to try to implement their views. There's also the Paris Commune and a couple other historical examples in the 18 and 1900s. If you're interested in it, which it is fascinating, especially to watch all the violence happen,